I'm going to show you how to send REST requests. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Brian Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing.
This is part 3 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. In this video, I'm going to show you how to send REST requests. RESTAPIExample.com was useful for us because it showed us how we could use different HTTP methods. We now know how to use GET, we know how to use POST, we know how to use PUT, and we know how to use DELETE. But as you'll recall, using that API, if we were looking closely, discovered that that API, while it looked like it was fully functional, wasn't actually doing things behind the scenes that we thought it was. We thought it was deleting the employee records that we were creating, but even though the delete request appeared to succeed, there wasn't actually any change in the back-end database. Same thing with POST methods and PUT methods. They looked like they were working, but they didn't actually do anything behind the scenes, which probably felt a little bit unsatisfying for you. So what we're going to do next is take a look at another API where not only will our requests actually be doing something behind the scenes in the REST server, in addition, you're going to have more control over the REST server this time. To do this, we're going to be taking a look at a tool called JSON-Server. And as you can see, I've already imported a collection that contains numerous different requests that I have defined for that specific REST API. Unlike our work with the APIs in the previous parts of the video, for this part of the video, I'm actually going to recommend that you go ahead and go to my GitLab repository and download and then import this JSON server collection that I've defined. Again, you've seen earlier in the video how to download collections from my GitLab repository and how to import them. So go ahead and grab this collection called JSON-Server. The reason why I'm suggesting that you download and import JSON-Server is if you open up JSON-Server, at the collection level, I have actually defined some instructions that we're going to follow to get this thing called JSON-Server up and running. So let me go ahead and open up the description here. And as you can see, our first step here is we need to go download and install something called Node.js. And we need the Node.js package manager. Now we can get both of those by going to https://nodejs.org/en/download. The en there stands for English. If you're a speaker of another language, you can go figure out how to download a version of Node.js suitable for your language. But we're going to work with English here. So let me actually bring up our web browser, and in the web browser I'm going to go to that URL, and we are going to find the version of Node.js that's appropriate for the platform that I'm on. I'm on Windows. You might be on Mac or elsewhere, so find the version of Node.js that's appropriate for your platform, and then download it. Save it someplace useful like your downloads folder. And then once we've got the installer downloaded, we're going to open it up and run through that installer to install Node.js. Now, the exact steps that we're going to go through here are going to look one way for Windows. For other platforms such as Mac and Linux, things will look a little different, but I'm sure you can find your way through those other installers. But here's what it looks like with the Windows installer. Let me open up the installer. We'll say run. And essentially what we're going to do here is just keep clicking the next button. So we have a welcome screen. We'll click next. On this screen here, we've got our license agreement. We'll accept that license agreement and click next. we'll go with the default folder location. So we're going to install Node.js into the C:\program files Node.js folder. We'll click Next. And then here, we need, at a minimum, we need Node.js runtime installed, and we also need this npm package manager. Now, I'm actually going to install everything, but the key things we need are Node.js and npm. Let's click Next. And as you can see here, there are some tools for native modules that you can also additionally install. We won't need them for what we're doing here. If you'd like to install them, you feel free to do so. But for our purposes here, we're going to leave this checkbox unchecked and simply click Next. And as you can see, we're now on the final screen. If we're ready, we'll click Install, and the installation will kick off. And shortly here, we'll have Node.js installed.
You want to hear about training promos? Check out the URL in the description below.
As you can see, we've got Node.js installed. So let's click Finish. And in order to make certain that this is working, why don't we open up a command line prompt. Here in Windows, I'm going to open up the DOS command prompt. And I am going to run a command called node. That will actually start up the Node.js environment. And I'm going to pass in the -version option. I don't actually want to run Node.js entirely just yet. I just want to know that it's there, that it's in my search path, and that we can get to it. So let's run node --version. And as you can see, I have successfully installed version 18.16.1. Your version number may be different from mine, and that's okay. Additionally, we want to make certain that we have the Node.js package manager, so let's run its command, once again with the --version option. And as you can see, I have successfully installed npm version 9.5.1. Again, your version number may be different, and that's okay. All right, so we've got Node.js installed, and we've got npm installed. The reason why we've installed those two things is these two pieces of software are going to enable us to run something called JSON-Server. Now, JSON-Server can do a lot of different things, but for our purposes, what JSON-Server is going to do is it's going to allow us to create a REST server that allows us to store and retrieve information of our own choosing. In our example here, what we're going to use JSON-Server to do is to create a database of employee records. So let's once again go back to Postman and see how we're going to do this. So in Postman, the next step is we need to use the npm command to install JSON-Server. So let's go back to our command line prompt, and we're going to do an install. We're going to do an npm install -g JSON, not JSON, JSON-server. npm install -g JSON-server. And we'll give it a few moments here to do the installation. I'll take liberties here with the editing of the video to speed this up. And as you can see, the installation of JSON-Server is done. By the way, that took approximately 15 to 30 seconds. It's pretty darn quick. Let's go back to Postman and see what our next step is. The next thing that we need to do is to create a JSON file that contains some data in it. As you can see right here, the JSON data that I'm supplying is going to be in effect, a database of employee records. So let's copy that code. You'll notice that code is in JSON format. We'll copy that code. We'll go to Notepad++. We'll paste in that code. And I'm going to go to File, Save. And I'm going to save my file as employees.json in my Documents folder. So let me go ahead and save that. Now, as you can see, looking at this JSON formatted data here, it's all showing up as a single line. If you wanted to, you could print this JSON data right now using JSON tools. You could go do a pretty print if you'd like to. Feel free to do that. I'm actually going to leave this as is to illustrate later on that JSON-Server is going to automatically pretty up the format here the first time we make any change to the data in here. So whether we add a new employee or update an employee or delete an employee, any sort of change like that is going to trigger JSON-Server to pretty up this file anyways. All right, so I now have my data file. And what we're going to do next, according to our instructions, is step number 4 is we're going to go to the command line prompt again, and we're going to run JSON-Server on our JSON file. So let's do that. Let's run JSON-Server on our file, which, by the way, I put down in my documents folder. So wherever you put your folder, type the path name to it, hit enter, and as you can see, JSON-Server is running, and it's actually running as a REST server on top of HTTP. But whereas ordinarily HTTP runs on port 80, you'll notice here that JSON-Server is running on port 3000. There are 2 URLs. Let's go to a web browser and look at this first URL. So again, we go to a web browser, we type Control-T or open up a tab however you want. I'm going to type HTTP, not HTTPS, HTTP. We're going to go to localhost :3000, hit enter, and as you can see, it's taking us to this nicely formatted web page that lets us know JSON-Server is running. It lets us know that with its REST API, we're going to be able to do different HTTP methods on our data. So we'll be able to do gets and posts and puts and so forth. And right here, it's letting us know that the JSON data that we loaded in has a single type of resource in there. It's got employee records. So again, if you want to know more about how to do the get, put, post, and so forth, you can read the documentation here, but I'm going to show you how to do it. So feel free to hit pause and look at the documentation, but join me here in a moment and I'll show you how to do it. Additionally, this link here is actually going to the same URL that we just saw. Whether we manually type this URL or we click on this link, it's going to take you to the same place. It's going to show us the 6 employees that we have in our data file. So let's click here. Again, notice this is the URL that we just saw in the DOS command prompt window. And sure enough, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 employee records in our JSON data. The first record is for me. That's me, Brian. I'm located in California. On the other hand, my colleague Joe, he's located in New York. Joel's located in Florida. Linus is in Nova Scotia. Matt and Tim are in Texas. And we also have another colleague of ours that we're going to add using a REST request here shortly. So we're going to leave her out. She's a mystery right now, but you're going to see how we can add data records to the stuff that we're starting out with here. So again, we've got 6 employee records to start out with. But this video series is not about how to use a web browser to do queries. This is a video series where we're using tools such as Postman to issue REST requests to do interesting things. So here is the JSON-Server collection that I previously suggested you download from my GitLab repository. If you haven't downloaded it, that's fine. You can manually create all of these REST requests yourself. But if you simply go download and install this collection, you'll be ready to follow right along. So in here, I have a request called get all employees. Let's take a look at get all employees. So get all employees is using the get method, and it's using the URL http://localhost:3000/employees. By the way, the documentation would tell you that that's a URL endpoint. And because this particular operation is a get and it's super simple, we don't need to specify any parameters. We don't need any authorization. We don't need any headers. We don't need a body. We don't need any of this stuff. All we need to do is get this URL. Now, again, I already set up this collection. I already defined all these requests, so there's no need to save. We've saved in all the previous examples, but here I don't need to save. I just need to click send. And you'll notice when I click send that we get back a status code of 200. That's good. And we can see in the body the same 6 employees that I just showed you. So we've got Brian, we've got Joe, we've got Joel, Linus, Matt, and Tim all here in this file. Now, this first request looked up all the employees, but what if you just wanted to look up a single employee? Well, you could define another request like this one here. This is set up exactly the same way. The only difference is the tail end of the URL is using a path parameter to specify which employee we want to look up. Now, if you didn't notice this here, back in our data, notice that each employee, such as Brian, has a unique ID. So Joe's ID is 2. Joel's ID is 3. So if we say that we want to look up ID 1, well, let's see what happens. We click send, we got a 200, and here is the record for the employee with ID 1. Yours truly. If we want to, we could change that request. For example, I seem to recall that Linus is employee number 4. That's his ID. Let's click send, and sure enough, there's Linus. So we can use this REST request that we've defined to look up individual employee records. Now, once again, like previous parts of this video, I'm using hard-coded values here. Later on in the videos, we'll show you how to use variables, which would make this much more flexible. But for right now, using these hard-coded values is working great. Let's look at our next request. Our next request is a post. You know from earlier in the video that posts, HTTP post method is used to create a new resource. So we're going to create one new employee. To do so, the URL looks like this. It's the same URL that we started out with, but you simply say post. You don't say an ID number in the URL because JSON-Server is going to assign the ID. You just say post, you say this URL, and then this time we do need to pass in the body. The request body here is defining what we want the new employee record to look like. And you'll notice it contains the same 2 pieces of information that we've seen previously. It has my colleague Trina's name here. It has her location. What's missing here, actually hit pause and see if you can figure out what's missing from this body that you saw earlier. What's missing here is the ID. The way this particular REST API works, when you want to create a new resource, you do not specify the ID. You specify everything else, but you don't specify the ID because JSON-Server is going to assign the ID. All right, let's click send and see what happens here. We click send. As always, we check to see, oh, this is interesting. We didn't get a 200 this time. We got a 201. But both 200 and 201 and 202 and 203 and so forth are in the 200 series. Those all indicate success. 200 is what we're getting back when we do gets. 201 is what we get returned when we successfully create some new resource in the REST server. So 200, 201, for our purposes, means essentially the same thing, but to be really specific here, it successfully created the employee record for Trina. And notice here in the response body, we see the same 2 pieces of data that we said in the request body. The request body said we want an employee record that has this info, and sure enough, this response body says this record has this info, plus the response body also is showing us the ID that was assigned to Trina's employee record. All right, let's go take a look at the put. You know that put method is used for updating or modifying, how we want to describe it, changing a resource. In this case, we're going to change the employee record for whoever is the employee with ID 1. Well, you know that's me. Again, if you've forgotten that, if we go back to get all employees, the person who has ID 1 is me, Brian. So over here with our update 1 employee REST request, we're doing a put. When you're doing a an update with the put, you need to use the same URL that we've been using. And in this case here, it does need to have a path parameter to indicate which employee. So I'm saying ID1 here. And like the post, when we do a put, you typically need to pass in a request body. Now notice in the case of this request body, we can see that here is the new name that I want stored in this employee record. Here is the new location that I want stored in that employee record. There's no ID here in the request body because the ID is in the URL. So whereas before the name and location was Brian in California, we're going to change it to Mr. VVork in Santa Cruz. Let's hit send. Actually, just before we do, I forgot to point this out. Build up a little suspense here. Let's go back to Notepad++. Notice that Notepad++, after we did the post, or for that matter, if we do a put or we do a delete, if we do anything with these REST requests that causes the data to be modified, whether that's adding a new record, modifying a record, or deleting a record, anytime any sort of change is occurring to the data, here's what's happening. Well, first thing that we see that's happening is Notepad++ detects, hey, something happened to the employees.json file. Do you want to reread it? Well, yeah, let's say yes. So we say yes, and as you can see, let me scroll over here. As you can see, my employees.json file has been, oh so kindly, pretty formatted by JSON-Server, which I promised you would see it do a little while ago. So currently, the employee with ID 1 is me, Brian, in California, but we're going to change so that the name will be Mr. VVork and the location will be Santa Cruz. Let's do that in 3, 2, 1, send. All right, we got back to 200. We can see what was returned. Let's go actually back to Notepad++. Notice Notepad++ once again is indicating, hey, somebody changed the employees.json file. So let's reread it and watch what happens here on lines 5 and 6 when I say, yes, reread the file. Those lines, in fact, changed exactly the way we said that we wanted them to. All right, as you can see, we have one more request here, which is going to delete an employee. Now, to delete an employee, we're going to do a delete method. We're going to use a URL that ends with the ID of the user, the employee that we want to delete. Since this is delete, deletes typically don't need a body, but they do need you to do things correctly. Can you see something that I'm doing here that's not correct? I know that when I hit send here, this is going to fail, but can you spot it? Let's hit send. This is going to fail, and let's see if you can figure out why. So I hit send, and notice it says this time we got back a 404, which if we're doing web browsing, that would mean I can't find that web page. Well, here we're not browsing to a web page. We're using an HTTP delete method to delete an employee record resource in JSON-Server, but it can't find a employee record that has ID 8. And sure enough, if we go back to all of our employees and look at all these IDs, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and actually, if I send this again, we'll also get Trina. So 4, 5, 6, 7, and there's Trina. Trina has the highest ID. There is no ID 8. So if we attempt to delete a user, an employee that doesn't exist, we're going to get a 404. But we could, if we wanted to, go delete somebody like, let's get rid of that Brian guy. He's the guy at ID 1. If we hit send, you'll notice that it says it succeeded. And in the case of a delete operation, this particular REST server returns a response body that's essentially empty. Strictly speaking, it's not completely empty. This is a JSON object, but there's nothing in that object. That user's gone. If you want to prove that to yourself, go back to get all employees, send a get all employees, and as you can see here, Brian is now missing. He's been deleted. Oh well, bye-bye, Brian. All right, so again, in this particular example where we're working with JSON-Server, the key thing that I wanted to do in this part of the video is to give you more insight and more control over what's going on in the JSON server itself. You controlled what data was in the employee.json file. If you wanted to have different types of data, you could have put in either instead of employees or in addition to employees, you can put whatever types of resources that you want into that JSON data file. You just need to make certain that you format it correctly. So you now have worked with more of a behind the scenes view of what's going on in the REST server, but strictly speaking, you didn't actually create a REST server. We'll talk about how to create a REST server later on, but JSON-Server is a fine example of a REST server that's going to give you a lot more control over the data on the REST server itself.
Join me in the next video for more example APIs.